when you're feeling those internal symptoms or signs, is to ask ourselves, okay, how can I calm that? Naturally, as human beings, we try to figure this out first before we calm the internal response. Calming the internal response is really, really important.
Hey guys, thank you for joining us today. We are talking about a heavy subject, which is anxiety. It's so much unknown in our world today right now. We got kids getting ready to go back to school, don't know if they're gonna stay in school or not, going virtual. You may be working from home, getting ready maybe to go back in the workplace, and that may switch. It's so much unknown. Everything changes week to week. So I wanted just to address this issue, but I have the privilege and honor of interviewing my friend, Sara Cornwell. Sara, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and just about what you do, your family?
Sure. So I'm Sara Cornwell. I'm a licensed clinical social worker. So what that means is that I do individual and family therapy. Okay. I work for Phoebe Putney Memorial Hospital. I manage their employee assistance program. So we have an internal EAP at Phoebe Putney. And what that means is that I provide individual and family therapy for Phoebe employees, their spouses, and their dependents. And so I exclusively see Phoebe employees that are within their Phoebe health system. I am married to Marcus Cornwell. We live on Pineland Plantation in Newton. And I have two little rascals. I have Lincoln, who's 4.5 years old, and Kinley, who's 2.5.
And they're the cutest little kids ever.
Thank you. I'm a little partial, but I agree.
I love it, love it, love it. And I'm so glad to have Sara here today because she can bring the clinical side and give us some tips on how to take care of ourselves in this season of just so much unknown.
Yes.
And so our very first question we want to start off with, can you give us the clinical definition of anxiety, maybe the clinical definition, maybe the general one, and what are some symptoms of people that deal with anxiety?
So anxiety can be so much more than just an emotion or feeling. I think that most of us know anxiety to be that, right? An emotion or feeling. For individuals that have a clinical diagnosis of anxiety, what that means is that they have excessive worry or fear that actually takes over their daily living. So what that would mean is that it starts to interfere with work, with school, maybe interacting in like social engagements with others. And so it's very individualistic. And so what one person's anxiety and what that individual's stressors and triggers are and what another person's stressors or triggers are can look completely different. The other thing is I think naturally when we talk about anxiety, when we watch movies and things like that, when they depict anxiety, oftentimes we see somebody that's, just so anxious and worried.
Yeah.
But that's not what normally anxiety looks like. Externally, most of us look quote unquote normal. But internally, somebody that's dealing with anxiety, it feels like the fire alarms are going off. And so they are having this internal response that then they're trying to externally deal with.
Yeah.
And it's very complex. So it can be something that people really, really struggle with.
Yeah, and I think for me, like when I'm anxious, I tend to bite my nails, or this is gonna sound really weird. I can't believe I don't even say this on camera, but I scratch out my eyebrows.
Oh yes.
Like I'm like stressed when I'm stressed, and when I become anxious or nervous. Some of the
people
things
that will pull their eyelashes or hair.
So I can tell. I told one person one time, like, if you see me with no eyebrows, that's because I'm anxious.
I'm stressed to the max.
Yeah, I'm stressed and all that. And so, thank you for that. What are some symptoms, or maybe like you might have talked about that?
Well, so some signs and symptoms that we would look at for anxiety. Again, it can be a combination of things, but what that may look like is heart racing or heart palpitations. It could be shortness of breath. Some people feel really hot or really cold. They may actually have clammy hands. Some people will feel nauseated or sick to their stomach. Some people may develop headaches. Some people will actually have aches and pains like throughout their body.
Oh, wow.
most of us, even if we don't deal with anxiety on a regular basis, most of us know when we get overwhelmed, right? I mean, most of us can relate to stress. And so, I would ask yourself, okay, what are some of those warning signs? And so we tend to know when we get overwhelmed. Just like you mentioned, I know, so for me, I experience crying spells. So if I'm really overwhelmed in a good or bad way, I cry. And so it's not the prettiest. I think Oprah one time said, I don't think anyone has a pretty cry. But that also is a warning sign to myself that have I been taking care of myself, and have I been doing that consistently? And so I think first off, it's recognizing that maybe we might be having some of those symptoms, but also, is it to a point that maybe we need to seek help or consult, with someone, and not just a therapist, is that maybe confiding in a friend, a family member, a support system, but also just how am I taking care of my overall health?
Yeah, I love that, because your health, your physical health is just as important as your emotional health.
Yes.
Those things are totally important and coincide with each other, I would say. Like how you're taking care of yourself physically can affect how you feel emotionally, and vice versa. Oh,
I agree. I don't think you can separate them, right? That's why, for example, when we're stressed, you may have physical tension, right? And so, we have to find different ways of also coping with that. So how I cope with my tension in my shoulders might look differently than if I'm having racing thoughts, or if I'm having crying spells or those things. And so it's figuring out ways that we cope with that. And again, consistency is key, because most people have the tools, most people know how to cope, but the biggest factor is most people don't do that consistently. I can ask people, what do you do to de-stress and relax and unwind? And most people can tell me those answers. The unfortunate thing is that when you follow up with, when's the last time you did that, or how often are you doing that? Sometimes it can become crickets. And again, it's finding consistency, whether that's daily, weekly, monthly. Again, you have to have some consistency in order to reap the benefits.
Yeah, especially in this culture where we're at now. Like with COVID and isolation in the beginning, when we were especially in Albany, we were 3 months where we couldn't leave or anything like that. And so much unknown. You may be even feeling more aware of something's off.
Right. I think even people that don't tend to deal with generalized anxiety, maybe don't have a clinical diagnosis. I think almost everybody at some point in time in 2020 can say, I've had some increased concern or anxiousness. Yeah. Because there have been so many changes that have happened simultaneously. And I would say, especially for those of us here in Albany, again, it was kind of like an overnight sensation where we went from not being a hot spot to being a hot spot. And so many lives were drastically changed, literally overnight.
Yeah. And I have to say, Sara, you were a beast at Phoebe. She was, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but you were there talking to the people that couldn't see their families that were positive in COVID in the hospital, making sure that the Phoebe employees had treats and just be able to eat, because it was such a stressful time. Yes. They probably didn't get a chance to go home or eat or do all that stuff. So I just remember you in that time just running around crazy, but you were awesome.
Well, thank you.
You do that.
Well, yeah, so I was providing support services for our chaplain. Will Runyon is amazing at Phoebe, and he does a wonderful job, but it was becoming overwhelming, and trying to provide what we were doing is running iPads for our patients that might be on our critical care units. And because of COVID, they had the limitations on not being able to have family members up in the rooms with them. And so having that communication is key. That actually affects people's care, right? Again, your physical care, your emotional and mental well-being plays a factor into that. And so even if that was family members just being able to talk with their family, even if maybe somebody's on a vent and can't talk back, but being able to hear their family's voice or those things might have actually been a positive factor for some people in fighting and hopefully getting better and being able to successfully go home. But yes, that was a trying time for everyone.
Yeah, that's crazy. What advice would you give to someone that is exhibiting anxiety symptoms in this current climate? We kind of just touched on it, but what advice would you give?
I think the biggest thing is, and I know I harp on that so much, is what kind of firm foundation do you have? So anytime I'm talking with an employee, a client, I like to focus on three things. How are you sleeping? How are you eating? And how are you coping? So Sleep. I
Yeah.
think all of us would sign up for more sleep, right?
Amen, sister.
If we
Amen.
can. We say catch up on sleep, but you don't really catch up on sleep. However, are you having difficulty falling asleep? Are you having difficulty staying asleep? Also, do you have good sleep hygiene? And what I mean by that is, are you going to bed at a decent hour? Are you trying to wake up at a decent hour? Having some type of schedule and structure is actually really helpful. Your body responds to having some type of schedule. Again, most people in America, we say 3 meals, but most people eat on average about 2 meals a day. Are you getting that? Again, if you're only getting 1 full meal a day, are you fitting in some snacks? Are you staying hydrated? Your hydration plays a big factor into your energy level as well, because you have to replenish yourself in order to be able to give and do.
Yes, sure.
And then that goes to coping. So how are you coping? And coping also includes your support systems. Who are your support systems? Is that family? Is that friends? Again, is that maybe a therapist or somebody out in the community? But who are you talking to? Because sometimes this can be our worst enemy. When we internalize and keep it all here, that's really difficult. It's difficult to get through life completely on your own. Doesn't mean I don't want individuals to be, independent and be able to be successful in being independent.
Yeah.
But we also have to be able to look at others and be able to process sometimes what's going on. And again, sometimes that's with a licensed professional, but sometimes that may just be with family or friends. So who are you opening up to? And again, are you doing that consistently?
Yeah, reaching out for help when you need it.
Yes.
Having people that you can talk to, and having people that's going to tell you the truth and going to be helpful.
Right.
And not just like people that like just let you vent and be like, oh, well,
Well, we have different people that we go to for different things, right? So
that's true.
It's not about so much how many friends or family you have, but I do think it's important to not just rely on just one person.
Yeah.
That can be overwhelming and consuming for someone else. People that are empaths oftentimes take on a lot of not only their own stress, but they'll take on other people's stressors. So if you're a true empath, you have to be careful of that too, because we like giving of ourselves, but you also take actually additional nourishment and replenishing because you're constantly giving that out and handing that out.
Yeah.
So again, what I may talk to my sister about and what I may talk to my mom about or what I may talk to a coworker about might look differently.
Yeah.
But I'm having those conversations, and I'm trying to do that as much as I can in real time, not letting it just build and get to a point like a breaking point.
Yeah, to a point where you feel like you
You're
don't know
gonna
what to do
explode.
what's next. Yeah.
Right.
And what are some things that young adults can do to calm themselves down when they're feeling anxious?
So we oftentimes talk about like breathing or relaxation techniques, and we can even practice one or two if you want to.
Sure.
But breathing and relaxation techniques are essential, as well as what we call mindfulness. So what mindfulness is, if you hear the word mindfulness techniques, is working on being present and in the moment. In particular with anxiety, oftentimes anxiety focuses either on the past, things that have happened, meaning there's been a stressor or trigger that has happened. So for example, I go into my yard, I see a snake, right? Okay, there's the trigger of the stressor. But then you can also, again, some people have those internal fire alarms that are going off even if there's not a trigger or stressor. And so when you're feeling those internal symptoms or signs, is to ask ourselves, okay, how can I calm that? Naturally, as human beings, we try to figure this out first before we calm the internal response. Calming the internal response is really, really important. If my anxiety goes from a 0 to a 10, or it's been building up throughout the day and I'm at a 10, I'm probably not at a place where I can rationally work through what's happening, right? So again, I always tell my clients, it's not as important to find out what the trigger stressor is. What we want to do is calm the internal response through first with those breathing exercises, those relaxation techniques. Once we can calm the internal response, then we can ask ourselves, okay, is there a current stressor or trigger? And whether or not there is or not, again, we might be able to say, well, that was the snake. If there's not a stressor or trigger, it doesn't take away from what you were feeling and experiencing.
Yeah.
But what that may mean is then we have to go and identify that as, okay, that's my anxiety, right? No, I'm not crazy. No, just because I feel that way doesn't mean that that's what's happening. But it's my anxiety. Let me name it for what it is, and let me get to a place where I can rationalize what's happening.
Yeah, and I love what you talk about, because so many times we're trying to think logically when our emotions are screaming at us, and that's just not going to happen.
Right.
When your emotions are screaming at you, the very thing you can do is like, okay, I'm just not in a place to rationally or logically, or for me to make good choices.
No, you're right.
To do that. Like if I'm feeling overwhelmed, I'm frustrated and I'm just barking at everybody, it's because I'm feeling overwhelmed or I feel
Right.
out of control.
Yes.
And so when things are happening outside of my control, it's just like I'm learning to be like, okay, just to calm down, because
Right.
now I'm triggered. Now I realize real quick, like I'm triggered because I feel out of control. So let's bring it back.
Right.
What can you do to control your situation? I can breathe.
Yes.
I can calm my mind. I can focus on one thing or choose to put something away I don't need to focus on.
Right.
It gives you choices once you realize that my emotions are driving me. And when your
Right.
emotions are driving, sometimes it's not the best
Right. Well,
scenario.
And even if we have an internal response that we can't understand or rationalize, again, it doesn't change the fact that you're still experiencing that internal response. I think, again, we tend to look for the external, the external signs and warning signs. But I think that also means that if you have anxiety, and maybe you have a clinical diagnosis, and even if you don't, it's sharing some of those triggers and stressors to your support systems around you, right?
Yeah.
My anxiety looks like this because, right, what your stressors and triggers are and how you want to be comforted and supported in that looks differently than someone else.
Yeah. So everybody's just different.
No, I mean, it is. I mean, and I know that sounds so cliche,
No.
right? We're just different. But we are unique. And how you want to receive help and support looks differently too. And probably how you want to receive help looks differently from person to person, right?
Yeah.
Because you probably tend to go to certain people for certain types of support than other people. I mean,
That's
you would
true.
get a different level of support from a coworker than you probably would a family member or a best friend.
Yeah. So I guess that goes into this last question I have for you. Why is it important to practice self-care? Because I think self-care is like this word I think I learned probably the last 3 or 4 years of what are you doing to managing to take care of you, to feed you,
Right.
What time are you taking to replenish yourself? And so can you speak to the importance of having a self-care in your individual life?
So I normally challenge clients to take 15 to 30 minutes at least 2 to 3 times a week. If I tell clients, hey, I need you to go spend an hour on yourself, for some people that's actually very stressful. Even though they may enjoy that time, they're going, where am I going to find that? So 15 to 30 minutes is usually something that people are able to set aside and are able to consistently do. What I also find is if you start off with 15 to 30 minutes consistently, most people will find additional time because they'll find that it benefits them. So again, is that exercise? Is that reading? Is that time at church or prayer time? I mean, is that time with family and friends? Is that sitting down and eating a hot meal? Is that another 30 minutes of extra sleep? What that is for you, it's figuring that out. And some of that is trial and error, because how I used to cope 10 years ago in my single life probably looks differently than me now as a parent, right? I mean, my me time usually consists at nighttime when everyone in my house is quiet. Everyone's asleep.
Yeah.
And so I myself sometimes deal with racing thoughts at night, and it tends to be more profound at night. Most of us tend to, as our day goes on, develop increased stress. That's just normal, right? So most people would say their afternoons or evenings are worse than the mornings, even on good days, because it tends to kind of build throughout the day. So for me, I have to calm this. So I like to have some kind of positive distraction. Oftentimes I read, that's when I watch my DVR shows with no interruptions. But I have to be able to have some time to kind of decompress and kind of emotionally and mentally just take a break. But that's what works for me. I also, in order to relieve physical tension, because when I get stressed, I CrossFit. Don't have a CrossFit body, not going to the games, but but I do it.
Yeah.
But again, it's finding out what works for you specifically. And so when I work with clients, sometimes I'll encourage them to try different things.
Yeah.
Journaling's a really good one. If you're dealing with something that you may not feel comfortable processing with somebody out loud, sometimes journaling can be really helpful. And that's not even necessarily has to be a daily thing, but sometimes journaling will also show you or reveal to you certain things, you go, okay, I keep bringing this up. Okay, well, why do I keep bringing that up? I mean, maybe there's more, there than I thought.
There, yeah.
Right. Most people come into my office, I would say, for surface level issues. I'm not downplaying what they're coming in for, but most people will come in with generalizations, right? I'm coming in for grief. I'm coming in for anxiety, depression, whatever they may be. But it's kind of like, therapy is kind of like peeling back the onion. And so as you're peeling it back, you start to realize, okay, what's really at the heart of the matter? And it can be so many different things. It's not, I think everyone goes, oh, is that about my childhood? Not necessarily, it could be. But it's important for us to really find out what's at the heart of the matter, because if we don't process and cope with that, you're going to continue to have the surface level issues. That doesn't mean we're perfect. You are normal. If you sometimes feel anxious, you are normal. To be honest with you, if I met anyone during even just this pandemic that said, oh, everything has been sunshine and rainbows, and I'd be going, what is going on? Because at some point in time, you probably should have felt a little bit off kilter, right? I mean, no, I don't want anyone feeling complete sadness or anxiety, but to have some of those responses, that's a normal response to stress.
Yeah, it makes sense in this time. I mean, the whole world stopped. And then not only that, you have social injustices that came up. It's just so much feelings and emotions that, like, even for me, I struggle with. I had to step away. Like, social media became too much for me. It was so much overload. It was one of those things, when I picked it up, I would literally like leave angry watching what some people post, whether I agree with it or not. And finally got to a point, you're choosing to feed yourself this. So I've been I had to be like, okay, I'm gonna step away.
Well, I will say that. So I agree with you. Social media can be an awesome thing. I do think it's important to set some limitations on that. So again, what does that mean for you? Does that mean I'm only looking at it a certain time of day? Does that mean I'm only looking at it, for a certain amount of time each day? The other part of that is I think it's completely okay to sometimes disengage or take, a break from things. Also, even just news. I mean, I think oftentimes we see news as a good outlet. I think you can even overwhelm yourself with that, right? So normally I want you to stay informed, but I would normally recommend for you to pick one outlet that you look to. And again, not going 3 and 4 times a day. Find one time a day to look at that outlet, to see what's being said, to stay informed. But beyond that, wait until that next day, because we can literally be overloaded with just so much information. And that's the difficult part about this pandemic as well, is that there's so many unknowns, and we hopefully are going to be getting more answers. And we're definitely not where we were 3 and 4 months ago, but there's still so much unknown. And that honestly just feeds the anxiety, because again, anxiety is either based off of the past, what has happened, or all the what ifs of what's going to happen. And it's not good to play the what if game. I call that going down the rabbit hole, like Alice in Wonderland. And that can be a very deep, dark place. And we want to try to avoid that as much as possible.
Yeah, that's the what if game is a never ending game. It never ends. Because there's always going to be something off of it. So what come to mind is, I don't know if you remember that show with Phoebe. This is a song that doesn't end, and it go on and on. My friend, I'm like, that song literally never ends, and that's what ifs are as well.
It is, because it's not saying that the likelihood. What it's saying is the likelihood of those what ifs happening is very slim. It's not saying it can't happen, but that's 1% versus the 99% that's probably likely happening, right? And you don't want to be driven by the 1% that might happen versus what tends to be your firm foundation.
Yeah. Well, Sara, I want to thank you for joining us today. I pray and hope that you guys take some tips, some things. Make sure you take care of yourself in this season, and just really focus on what you can control. It's so much in our world that's constantly changing, but you have control over your breath, over the things that you enjoy, some of the things that we talked about. So we hope this is something you can take with you throughout your day, throughout your week, to just make sure you take care of yourself, because you are important. All right, you guys, we'll see you on the next episode.